My BFF wants her dad to walk her down the aisle, even though he killed her fiance's parents. Part 1. When I, Brooke, 28 female, say her dad, Dan, 58 male, killed her fiance's parents, I don't mean literally. There is a lot of history here. I'm gonna go over it as much as possible, without making this too long. Kristen, 27 female, and Chris, 28 male, met 5 years ago. They dated for 2 years when he proposed and they moved in together. At their engagement party was the first time the families met. Everything seemed fine and all parties appeared to get along. Well, apparently some of them got along too well. This all came out a year later. Dan and Chris's mom, Kate, 55, female, were having an affair. Not excusing either party, I know it takes two to tango, but all the evidence shows Dan started it. He initiated contact. He was the first to send an inappropriate message. He booked the first hotel room, and so on. Kristen's mom straight up divorced her dad and moved. Kristen has always been a daddy's girl, and in some weird ways took his side in the divorce, which created a rift between her and her mom. Mom has been completely hands-off during this whole 2 years, and is only coming to the wedding as a regular guest. A few days after the news came out, Chris's dad, Ernie, died from a massive heart attack. From what I've heard, he was Chris's hero. His dad was always there for his family. Chris was spending time with his dad in those days, and him just being absolutely distraught with grief. Chris immediately blamed Dan and Kate for his dad's death. He went full no contact with his mom. Kate kept trying to get in touch with him and pushed to work this out. Chris's younger sister Leslie kept telling her to give him time, but she wouldn't listen. From what I understand, Kate had her own mental breakdown after Ernie's death. She was apparently self-medicating and drinking quite a bit. 2 months after Ernie's death, Kate, in desperate attempt to talk to Chris, ambushed him at work. It got really ugly, with Chris telling her she was dead to him, she would never see a grandchild from him, never be in his life again, along with some choice names. Kate went home and called Leslie to vent, only to get chewed out again for not listening and showing up at his job. Then Leslie said she was done trying and didn't want to see her either. That night, Kate went on an especially heavy bender and died from an accidental overdose. Chris had permanently lost both parents in 2 months because of Dan. This obviously almost ended Kristen and Chris's relationship. They decided to give counseling a try, and in the 10 months following got back on track and began the wedding planning. Chris's one caveat through all of this is that Dan is gone from their lives forever. Kristen agreed to this in counseling. This last year, as her best friend and maid of honor, has been really trying. Unfortunately, Kristen is a bit of a bridezilla. Not quite totally awful, but annoying and unempathetic enough to have me questioning our friendship. I have been doing my best to help with the preparations. However, I have my own problems. About 5 months from wedding day, my husband decided he was divorcing me after 2.5 years. I'm not going to get into that now. I just want you to know what kind of mental state I'm in when this all turns crazy. Now to the bridezilla parts. First off, she's one of these brides that has had an image of her wedding since she was like 13 and is determined to make that happen no matter what. So this is a small destination wedding in Jamaica. It was supposed to only be bride, groom, 4 bridesmaids, 4 groomsmen, originally 4 parents. But we are down to 1 now, and about 12 other assorted guests like spouses and a few choice friends. I tried to tell her it would be best to just have the wedding here in the States, especially given everything that has happened. But she didn't listen. I've been tied up trying to help organize makeup, hair, dresses, tuxes for Jamaica, while at the same time getting fucking divorced. I have gotten very little sympathy from Kristen during this. She's always like, I know, I'm so sorry for you. I will absolutely be there for you every day. It's just this wedding. I just need to get through it. Yada, yada, yada. Anyway, I'm pushing through. Well, here's where the biggest problem comes in. About 1 month prior to the wedding day, Kristen decides she needs her dad walking her down the aisle. I know she was planning that the whole time, even if she didn't say it. She decided to bring this up to Chris, saying in her dream wedding, she has always pictured him giving her away. Then we can go no contact. It's just this one day. Chris freaks out, understandably. He says absolutely no way. They fight for an hour about this until finally Chris just says, fine, you can have him walk you, but it will be at your next wedding because this one is off. Chris leaves and doesn't come back. Kristen has a meltdown and starts calling me. She had decided that the day of my divorce finalizing was the day to do this, so I was not exactly available. After about 6 hours, she shows up at my new one-bedroom apartment. Yay! A total mess. I tell her she needs to start trying to call him. He ignores her for 2 days before we track down where he's at. They talk. She swears he is cut off and that this was just her being crazy before the wedding. He gives her another chance and the wedding plans continue. I'm not going to lie, I was kind of hoping the wedding was going to be off, but a few weeks later we all boarded a plane for Jamaica, and quite possibly the greatest shit show in the history of weddings. Part 2. We arrived. It was a tight schedule at the front end. Luckily, we had an early morning arrival. We had all day on day 2 for prep, wedding day 3. The bride and groom were leaving on a 4-day cruise on day 4, then returning to the resort for a week after. All the rest of the guests were there at the resort for days 4, 7. We were supposed to greet them up on their return from the cruise, before catching our own flights out later that day. It was really too much, but I was looking forward to basically 3.5 days of vacation. I really felt like I deserved it, dealing with the drama of this wedding for however long, and going through my own divorce during. The first red flag that it was going to get ugly came when the tuxedos got delivered. There were 6. I knew the groom and 4 groomsmen equaled 5, so why the hell were there 6? Kristen said it must have just been a mistake on their end. Who cares? At least it wasn't 4, with a laugh. I had my suspicions, and I'm sure you all are thinking the same thing. Day 2 and the morning of was a blur. Getting ready for the event, decorating, hair, makeup, dresses. Despite all this, I noticed Kristen texting of her phone a little more than usual, especially considering everyone was here with her. When we got to the actual ceremony and nothing crazy had happened, I was very relieved. Everyone walks out, it's all very nice. Chris is standing there at the altar, wedding party on each side. It's all good. Music starts and Kristen steps out with Dan on her arm. All of the air left the space, and this was an outdoor wedding. I looked at Chris, tears were forming in his eyes and a rage was brewing on his brow. A couple of the groomsmen were visibly pissed off. I was beside myself. I have known Kristen for 9 years and never thought she would be this dense and selfish. I'm sure she thought that Chris, being the good guy that he is, would never make a scene, and would just play the part, and that she would get the chance to smooth it over later. She was wrong. All the guests stared in pure bewilderment, shocked Pikachu face across every one of them. When they reached the altar, Dan, in a move of pure stupidity, extended his hand towards Chris. Yeah, I get this is a custom, but goddamn man, read the room. As he stood there with hand extended, Chris came with an overhand right that landed square on the nose. The blood spatter laid a red mist of droplets all over Kristen's white dress. Dan hit the ground, but he was a tough old bastard and popped up ready to fight Chris. As he charged, Chris's best man Bill came out of nowhere and kicked Dan square in the chest, sending flying to ground again. He wallowed around on the floor with the wind knocked out of him. One of the other bridesmaids' husbands jumped in to break things up. Meanwhile, Kristen was in Chris's face, just screaming. I got in between them and called the other bridesmaids to help get her out of here. They got in between us, and I turned to start pushing Chris out of the area. Dan was still flopping on the ground when his ex-wife got up, walked over, stomped on his balls, and then exited the area. As I was pushing Chris one way, Kristen slipped past the others and started screaming at me. You cunt! Don't think that taking and fucking my husband is gonna make up for not fucking your own. That was a low blow. This bitch has officially lost her mind. I turned to her and said, What did you say? She doubled down. You heard me. You ruined your marriage by being a boring fuck. Don't think you can make up for that by taking mine now. I snapped. And it was on. It was a mess of slapping and hair pulling and dress ripping. The other ladies jumped in and broke things up, both of us screaming at each other. Once everyone was separated, it calmed down. Different groups were pushed back in their rooms. I was reeling. Kristen had really cut deep. The idea I was after her husband was ridiculous. I had never so much as had a private conversation with Chris. That was just her being crazy, but to use my own divorce against me, to cut me the way my ex-husband had, that moment was too low. We were done. Friendship dead. Kristen, much to everyone's delight, made a flight change and left that very night back home, and took Dan with her. We all assumed we were getting kicked out of the resort for the fight, but the hotel manager said drunk Americans fighting at a wedding was pretty normal. He warned us if it happens again, though they'd call the authorities. The one bridesmaid and her husband managed to get Kristen and Chris's cruise trip switched to them for a low fee. Everyone slept off the rest of wedding day. Kristen's mom and a couple other older guests left on day 4. Chris stayed at the resort the rest of that week, as did the rest of the wedding party and a few other friends. We decided to live it up for 3 days. We started that night on day 4. I, for one, was cutting loose. I had the year from hell, divorce and bridezilla, all culminating in the most disastrous wedding ever. Well, it got weird on night 1. After some heavy drinking, I found myself waking up naked in bed with Chris. We both looked at each other in the morning like, what the hell did we do? And what do we do now? May not have been the best decision, but decided that going for round 2 right then was the thing to do. It was the first of many more rounds over the next few days. I had not been this uninhibited in so long. I made the most of every time. When the time for me to fly out hit, Chris still had another week at the resort for his honeymoon. We didn't do any romantic movies-esque goodbye or anything. I left on the same flight with a few other guests. Others had left at various times that day and the days prior. On my ride home, I was feeling very guilty. It was guilt for what happened with Chris, not for Kristen, fuck her, but for my ex-husband. I came to realize on that flight, I had this idea of what I wanted married life to be, or maybe just what it was supposed to be. I knew we both made mistakes, but for once I was starting to realize that mine were the ones that really led to our divorce. I had a fling with Chris, but what I really wanted was my ex-husband back. I was going to try when I returned. Unfortunately, I would find out some mistakes have a way of catching up with you, while others somehow come full circle. Part 3. I waited a full week before calling my ex-husband. I wanted to have all of my thoughts in order. I ran through things he might say. I ran through things I wanted to say. I had fake conversations with myself. When I finally sent him a text asking to talk, I was so nervous I hoped he wouldn't respond. Just like that, though, he texted back, "Why?" All the scenarios I ran through, and this wasn't one of them. I texted back and said I missed him and wondered if we could just talk. No pressure, just talk. He texted back, "I don't know. I'm not sure I want that. I know it probably took a lot to reach out. So I will say this. I'm not sure if I'm ready to talk. I would prefer if you gave me some time to think about that. Please don't message again. I will reach out once I have an answer and promise not to keep you waiting longer than a week." This was the longest week of my life. When I got a message from him exactly 1 week later, I got literally nauseous with nerves. He wanted to know why I missed him and why I wanted to talk. I told him I had revelation about our problems, that I didn't treat him fairly, that I was finally starting to see how I made him feel. I wanted to try again, that no matter what, I did choose him. I did want to be with him for life, have kids, grow old, all the things. He responded, "I'm not sure I want to try again, but I'm willing to continue to talk. We can see what happens from there. I'm going to go now. Feel free to call me tomorrow after work." For the next 3 days, we talked after work. The first couple days, we just caught each other up on our lives. It was awkward, like when you run into an old high school friend at the mall. But it was start. It was on the third day that things got real. We began to talk about our marriage problems. I know he was hurt and that I minimized his feelings. And when he asked for divorce, I got defensive and aggressive instead of listening. I was trying to just listen now when I had an intrusive thought. This thought made me ask, "Have you started dating or seeing anything? It's okay if you have. We said we would just talk, so I don't expect anything. I'm just wondering." He told me he had not. He did say he had created a dating profile, but that he hadn't put much effort into it and had not had a match. I felt relieved by this, but I should have realized what he was about to ask. He said, "Well, how about you?" I wanted so bad to lie, to not tell him about Chris, but I knew I couldn't hide it, so I told him all about the wedding, which I had said I wasn't ready to talk about up to this point, and what happened after. He asked a few more probing questions, and I knew I set us back. He got off the call pretty quickly after. I wondered if he would call me back. I tried calling and texting the next couple days but got no response. That's when I came to the realization. It had been at least 40 days since my last period. Panic set in immediately. I rushed out to the pharmacy and grabbed a 3-pack off the shelf. When the first one came back positive, I took the second, then the third, all positive. That same day, my ex-husband called me for the last time. I didn't waste time. I told him right away. We essentially said our goodbyes. He was certain that there was no future for us now. I cried for weeks straight. At that point, I contacted Chris and told him. Over the next month, we talked it out and came up with a plan for our future as parents. We had no plans of starting a relationship, just promised to be the best co-parents we could be. He was really supportive through the whole pregnancy and was in the delivery room when our daughter was born. 4 months after her birth, Chris stopped by to check on us. This was very common, and I felt good each time he did. He looked at me with this warm smile and said, "You want to go out with me? On a real date?" I was shocked at the time. He just continued, "I think we had so much trauma from our last relationships that neither of us was ready for another, but maybe it's time, and maybe we should give each other a chance." That was 5 years ago. We have been married for 3 now. I can't believe where we are. Our relationship dynamic has evolved, but we are closer and happier than ever. Kristen came back with some ugly social media posts and passive-aggressive stuff for the first 6 months post-wedding. I learned this from friends as I had blocked her up on my return. We didn't do any large pregnancy announcements, obviously, as the circumstances were a little embarrassing. We sent out exactly one, a picture of Chris standing behind me with his hands on my belly. The card just said, "Kristen, we're all doing so much better without you." We never heard from her again. After that last phone call, I never heard from my ex-husband again. I love Chris, but every once in a while my ex will creep into my head and I'll have moments of where I wish we at least had gotten closure. I heard he had met someone, but that was all I knew. That is until this past Saturday night, Chris and I left our girl with my parents and took ourselves on a little vacation. We got dressed up on Saturday night and went out to a club for the first time. We weren't there 15 minutes when we ran into my ex and his new wife. I didn't know what to say. He was so different, but in a good way. We took a moment to talk, and by the end of the night, I felt like we both finally had closure. I would give you all more details, but honestly, I feel like that's his story to tell.
Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and if you enjoy, smash that like button.